Our third speaker this hour is Cybele Sack. Cybele is an award-winning coach for social innovation hackathons and a consultant with a focus on inclusive design, digital accessibility, and social transformation. She began her career as an interpreter at Point Pelee National Park and continued as a researcher with Parks Canada's national headquarters. Welcome, Cybele.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Cybele Sack. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with brown hair and a ponytail and glasses. And the title of my presentation is The Many Paths to Accessibility, Hacking the Future. I'm in Toronto, which is on the treaty territory of the Mississauga of the Credit and the traditional territory of a number of First Nations and a home of many other First Nations, Inuit and Métis. As the focus of this talk is on co-design as a process, it's important to reflect on the need to co-construct directly with local Indigenous communities. The theme today is the barriers to accessibility in national parks. There are many barriers impacting individual visitors and employees, curtailing experiences of enjoyment, learning, and relationship. The barriers can be immediate and dramatic, or subtle and insidious, but the result is the same over time. So how might we find the path forward together? Next slide. I'm excited to speak with you today about innovative approaches to accessibility using co-design techniques to accelerate social change. To understand who's impacted by barriers and how, we need to first understand how communities have been excluded to date. Today, we'll consider processes to engage in collaborative and meaningful ways to identify pressing problems in national parks and transform barriers into opportunities for change. Next slide. People with disabilities have been left out from participation in recreation, discovery, employment, and education about our natural world and are underrepresented in these spaces. Efforts to address and remediate some of these barriers have been made in alignment with legislation, but there is much more work to be done to address inequity and exclusion. Innovative practices such as the hackathon process I'll describe today create opportunities for organizations to co-construct and co-design transformative solutions with communities in alignment with the principle of nothing about us without us. The barriers we need to address include ones that are physical or related to infrastructure, informational or related to communication, including in digital sphere, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, attitudinal barriers and assumptions. The most exciting aspect of an innovative approach to addressing accessibility is that it supports shifting the conversation away from minimum compliance and towards curiosity about what we might achieve when we work together. Next slide. On this slide, there's an image on the left of a bell curve, which emphasizes the outliers at the edges over the hill at the center, or the minority groups over the majority. On the right, there's a starburst, which is a model from the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCADU University in Toronto. It's an aerial view of that bell curve. So you see most people at the center represented by the biggest cluster of dots and fewer people at the edges represented by individual dots. There are 3 circles. The smallest around the cluster at the center reads design works. In other words, the design works for this group. The cluster at the center, the group outside of that, which says design is difficult to use, and the furthest out says can't use the design. So those furthest at the edges can't use it at all. These 2 diagrams illustrate how we need to, as we consider and solve for all problems from the start, to challenge ourselves to think about who we are leaving out, who's at the edges, who can't use the design at all. It's also important not to neglect those for whom the design is difficult, which is often those with less visibly presenting disabilities. And over time, the friction of difficult to use becomes too overwhelming to continue. Doing this work means thinking about diverse and multiple disabilities, intersectionality, conflicting needs, and historic trauma. Next slide. The universal design, or considering the needs of those at the edges when creating designs to support everyone. So these are ramps, curb cuts, elevators, accessible washrooms. We've been talking about this for about 50 years. The US Park Service has been engaging on how to implement universal design in national parks for about 30 years at least. Universal design and the need to accommodate people with disabilities emerged from prolonged advocacy by disability movements and is implemented in key legislation, as we know most recently with the new Federal Accessible Canada Act. Universal design provides frameworks to address barriers in alignment with the social model of disability, but it has limitations when adapting to individual needs. Inclusive design supports more personalized or customized solutions and better understands patterns of need of diverse communities. And design justice even then calls us further into action to consider how the barriers are forms of social injustice and systemic discrimination. So for instance, if you consider a sign in a park, the universal design looks at the sign itself and whether the surfaces are tactile, the sizes of the fonts, et cetera. Inclusive design would be like an implementation of a QR code with personalized access. And then design justice would look at, is this actually supporting people with disabilities to better gain access to these, to participation in parks from which they've been excluded. Next slide. So hackathons are a collaborative team-based event to move from problem to solution at an accelerated pace. The teams start with a needs-based problems and are facilitated through a process of understanding the problem, framing it, generating and selecting solutions, and developing a presentation to explain the difference their solution makes. They're one of the most commonly used processes in social innovation environments to engage with the public to generate new ideas and approaches and address priority needs. They are certainly not the only tool and activity that can be used for co-construction and co-design. So this is only an example that we're talking about today. In fact, hackathons can present barriers for people with disabilities, such as time limitations. So it's very important that during planning stages, you create a process that is meaningful and inclusive and you mitigate some of those concerns. Hackathons lead to often prizes at the end, but the best prize really is implementing ideas that emerge from the event. Next slide. So most hackathons use what's called a double diamond approach. So on this slide, there are two diamonds, the one on the left in blue and the one on the right in yellow. And these represent 4 stages. So the opening of the diamond, the first diamond, the closing of the first diamond, the opening of the second, and the closing of the second. So I've called these 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. And so the opening of the first one is about researching the problem. And then the closing of the first diamond is to define or focus the problem. And then the second diamond starts with developing potential solutions and closes the second diamond on delivering a specific solution. And so the reason why it's divided into these 4 stages is because it's very important to separate divergent thinking from convergent thinking, or to think about it as first, when you're brainstorming, to be really creative and open to really stretch the imagination about what might be possible, and then use the convergent thinking or more critical thinking to evaluate those options, and not to try to evaluate while you're developing ideas. And of course, if you're limited for time, you can just pick a piece of this to work on. These events are best when they welcome everyone into an environment that supports participants with values of respect, inclusion, and belonging, and brings many stakeholders together with many types of knowledge. Next slide. So after the double diamonds design process, so you're looking at the problem and then the solution, hackathons also then provide time to look at building the solution and pitching it. And so it's a facilitated process to move from problem to solution to building and pitching as a process to facilitate social change. There is a small diagram at the very top of the slide, which is an icon of a 3-dimensional cone that expands. And this is so that when we think about diverging, that we are not only expanding in a creative way, but that we are expanding to really reach out to those audience that we spoke about before with that starburst, so that we're really trying to always think about who we've left out from the beginning as we think about what the problem is and what the solutions are. Next slide. So now that we have discussed what a hackathon is and how it works, how does it apply to parks? And it's really important to consider these as how might we questions. So these are ways of framing questions at the outset of hackathon. Now, as you develop these questions for a hackathon, it's really important to actually do consultation and co-construction of these questions themselves with the impacted communities. Next slide. So this slide is every time you see an HMW, it means how might we. So how might we reimagine park infrastructure? And so this includes addressing physical barriers in natural environments. And these are examples of questions. So the next number of slides are going to go through sort of type of question and then sub-questions. So the types of questions that you might ask within a hackathon or start to explore, and you can imagine the organizing team then has some basic starting research information that they can provide for teams to get going on this when they're working on the problem. So I proposed a few questions just to start thinking in these ways. How might we address the diversity of needs across the park system from Prince Edward Island to the Pacific Rim? How do we consider the needs of northern parks? How might we consider shared use trails and access for assistive devices? Are we considering assistive devices in shared use trails? How might we stretch the capacity to access remote and rugged environments while keeping them pristine? How might we create accelerated pathways to local healthcare facilities? Some people won't go to parks because they think it might take too long to get to a healthcare facility if something happens. So how do we ensure that we can support people to feel safe accessing parks and still being able to access healthcare? How might we map the journey from the beginning of the end to the end of the trail to make sure that there's no barriers halfway through? How might we create spaces for rest and reflection? And so the next slide. So this slide looks at how might we enhance park navigation? How might we support seamless navigation from the digital to the real world and mitigate information and communication barriers? So this might include questions like, how might we address sensory needs? Does the signage mirror the website? Is the website signage accessible? If people are prepared ahead of time because the website is something that they've learned to understand, will they see it look like that when they get to the park? Is the web content future-proof related to standards of accessibility? How might we achieve that? How might we support cognitive needs? So that are there people with disabilities who are avoiding parks because of the difficulties with navigation and fear of getting lost? How might we do this if Wi-Fi is not always available? Next slide. How might we expand programs and partnerships to create welcoming spaces, to create a sense of belonging and attract new visitors with disabilities and support them in their first experiences of parks? So this includes, this is probably one of my favorite questions. How might we share accessible stories about parks, including strength-based disability narratives? Some of the talks from this event could be recorded potentially and played as an evening program or be the basis of a guided trail hike. How might we encourage first-time visitors through gateway camping programs, including ones that respond to transportation needs for intersectional, racialized, and lower income communities with disabilities? How might we partner with disability and travel groups to support mental health and sensory-based programming? How might we require accessibility as part of procurement and interagency strategy for parks, including equipment manufacturers and friends of park organizations? Maybe bringing new technologies that are available as ways for companies that are building things to try them out by providing days in the park where you can try new kinds of all-terrain vehicles, etc. Next slide. This slide looks at how might we transform the workplace to increase representation and leadership by people with disabilities in parks organizations. This includes aspects such as new recruitment and hiring practices, disability-specific academic partnerships, adaptive support and mentorship, career development and training opportunities, and workplace safety and health considerations. Next slide. So once you know how, what you want to engage about, you need a process to facilitate that. Next slide. So you need to think about, next slide. You need to think about who you'll engage with, logistics to create a collaborative environment, the digital tools you'll use, who your team is. It's always important to think about note-taking and ambassadorship when you're creating an event. And really to think about how the ideas coming out of the event will be used going forward. Next slide. So to conclude, I'd like to leave you with these questions. Who will you engage with to address barriers in parks? What are there in your pressing questions? How will you ensure your event is accessible? And what do you plan to do with the results of the event? Next slide. And thank you very much for your time. And I'd love to continue to engage on this conversation for anybody who wants to reach out. And I don't know if there is time for questions. So.
Thank you, Cybele. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, unfortunately, we ran out of time for questions, but we will connect you with our Slack channel and flip any questions that we have over to you to respond over there if that works. Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, that brings us to the top of this hour. We'll now take our break. Our next session will start at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we will see you all again shortly.